She rode through a blizzard so deep no man should have come back from it. He came back. He fell out of the saddle into his brother's arms with a small brown bottle frozen against his chest, in his hands the color of old paper, and his lips too cracked to shape the words she needed to hear. She knelt in front of him in her crimson dress, and she took the bottle, and she did not let her hand shake. He had ridden 40 miles of white for a sick boy, and for her, and he had not yet told her which. But that night in the small hours when the fire had burned down and the wind had finally broken, he would tell her, and what he said next would change everything. This is how a mail-order bride from Boston came to belong to a Colorado mountain, and to three men who had been waiting without knowing it for her. Listen close. The wind came down off the Rockies like something hunting. It carried the smell of pine and old snow, and it cut through wool and skin alike. And it made a young woman in a deep crimson traveling dress hold the collar of her coat tight against her throat, as though her own small fingers could hold the whole world out. Adelaide Whitfield stood on the wooden platform of the Silver Creek Depot and watched the last of the daylight bleed away behind the mountains. The stagecoach driver had unloaded her trunk an hour ago. The depot agent had locked the door behind her 30 minutes after that. She was alone now in the way a person can only be alone in a country that does not yet know her name. The wind moved her honey blonde hair where it had come loose from its pins, and the cold worked its way into her bones, the way grief does, slow and patient and sure of itself. In her gloved hand she held a letter. She had read the letter so many times that the paper had gone soft at the folds, and the ink had begun to gray, where her thumb returned again and again to one particular line. The letter had been written in a hand that was square and certain, the hand of a man who did not waste words because he did not have many to waste. It said she would be met at the depot on the 15th day of October. It said there would be a wagon and a man and a road home. It was the 15th day of October. The wagon had not come. The letter had promised her a home. The letter had lied. She heard the boots before she saw the men. 3 sets heavy, deliberate, the sound of leather and snow melt on weathered planks. Adelaide turned and she had to lift her chin. She had to lift it again. She was a small woman, 5 feet and 3 inches in her stockings, and the 3 men who had come for her were each of them tall enough to block out the dying light. The one in the middle stepped forward. He was the tallest, though not by much, and his shoulders were broad enough that the wind seemed to break around him before it reached her. He wore a long oilcloth duster, the color of wet earth, and a dark hat pulled low, and beneath the brim of it, his eyes were the color of whiskey held up against a fire. There was a thin, pale scar along the line of his cheekbone, an old one healed clean. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. "You'd be Miss Adelaide Whitfield," he said. It was not a question. His voice was low and quiet, and it carried. "I would be," she said. Her own voice came out smaller than she intended. She steadied it. "And you would be Mr. Maddox, Silas Maddox," he said. "These are my brothers, Hollis, Wyatt." The brother on his right, the one called Hollis, touched the brim of his hat. He was perhaps a half-inch shorter than Silas, and his face was gentler, his beard a touch lighter, and there was something in the way he stood that suggested a man more accustomed to listening than to speaking. The third brother, Wyatt, did not touch his hat. He stood with his weight on one heel and looked her up and down the way a man looks at a horse he is not sure he wants to buy. He was the youngest of the 3 and the most plainly dangerous, and his hand rested without thinking on the worn grip of the pistol at his hip. "Mr. Maddox," Adelaide said. She let her gaze move across the 3 of them, and she felt the breath catch high in her chest, and she did not let it show on her face. "There seems to have been some misunderstanding. The letter mentioned only one man." "Yes," Silas said. "About that. There's something you ought to know before we ride. Stay where you are, listener. Stay close. Before this story moves another step, take a breath with her. Because what comes next is the moment that decides everything. And if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and tell me down in the comments where in this country you're listening from tonight. There are men listening from porches in Tennessee, and from kitchens in Montana, and from workshops in Texas, and I want to know where you are. Now, back to Adelaide, back to the platform. Back to the cold. 3 months earlier, Boston, a narrow attic room above a narrow house on a narrow street where the gaslight never quite reached the upper floors. Adelaide Whitfield, 23 years old, sat on the edge of a brass bed that had belonged to her mother and read a letter for the 10th time that day. She had been an orphan since she was 16. The cholera had come through Boston in the summer of '71, the way the cholera came through every American city in those years, indifferent as weather, and it had taken her father in 3 days and her mother in 4. She had stood at the edge of 2 graves in the same week, and she had not cried because crying was a thing you did when there was someone left to cry to, and there had not been. Her father's brother, Reginald Whitfield, had taken her in. He had taken her in the way a man takes in a debt he intends to collect on later. For 7 years, she had lived in his house. She had cooked, and she had cleaned, and she had taught his 3 children their letters, and she had played the piano in the parlor when his wife wished to entertain visitors. She had grown into a young woman who could read 3 languages and arrange a dinner for 12 and copy a clean line of script and play Stephen Foster from memory. She had grown into a young woman whose value in the eyes of her uncle was a thing that could be measured against a sum of money owed to other men. The night Reginald Whitfield came up the attic stairs and told her about the advertisement, his breath had smelled of port wine and a particular kind of relief. He had a debt. The debt was $500. The debt was due. There was a man in Colorado Territory who needed a wife, and the man had written to a marriage broker in Chicago, and the broker had written to certain men in Boston, and Adelaide's name had been put forward, and the man in Colorado had written back. The man had sent $50. The man would send another $450 when she arrived. Reginald Whitfield, in telling her this, had not used the word sold. He had used the word arranged. But the look in his eyes had been the look of a man who has just put down a heavy thing and does not intend to pick it up again. She had read the man's letter the first time in her uncle's study, with the gaslight low, and her uncle watching her over the rim of a cut glass tumbler. She had read it the 10th time alone in the attic with a candle with her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck under her dress, where her uncle could not see it and could not sell it. The letter had said this: "My name is Silas Maddox. I am a rancher in the Colorado Territory 40 miles north of a town called Silver Creek. I am 32 years of age. I have buried both my parents, and I have not buried my brothers, and that is the long shape of my life. I do not know how to say what is needed in a letter such as this, so I will say what is true. I need a wife. I cannot promise you a soft life. I cannot promise you a city or a parlor or anything like the world you have known. I can promise you that you will not be hungry. I can promise you that you will not be cold. I can promise you that no man under my roof will lay a hand on you that you have not asked him to. I am sending $50 for the train and the stage. The rest will be paid when you come. If you come. If you do not come, I will understand it, and the $50 is yours to keep. Yours respectfully, Silas Maddox." She had read that letter, and she had felt 2 things at once. She had felt the cold press of being a piece of property changing hands. And she had felt something else, something stranger, something she could not name. It had been the way the man wrote about his brothers. He had written them like they were a wound he had decided to keep. It had been the way he had said no man would lay a hand on her. It had been the small, unguarded promise that she would not be cold. She was so tired of being cold. On the morning of her departure, Aunt Margaret came up the attic stairs. Margaret Whitfield was not a cruel woman. She was only a woman who had married a cruel man and had spent 30 years pretending she had not noticed. She brought a wool shawl that had been her own mother's and a small sewing kit in a cloth bag with 3 biscuits and a wedge of hard cheese. She put the things on the bed, and she held her niece's face in both hands, and she said in a voice that had been kept very quiet for a very long time, "If it is bad, child, if it is truly bad, you write to me and I will find a way. I will find a way." Adelaide had nodded. They had both known she would write no such letter. There was no way to be found. She had carried her trunk down the stairs alone. Her uncle had not come out of his study. She had walked to the depot in a cold gray Boston rain. She had boarded the train going west with a one-way ticket and $50 and her mother's ring against her skin and a folded letter in the pocket of her crimson dress in the strange, sober conviction of a young woman who has decided that whatever waited for her in the mountains could not in any case be worse than what she was leaving behind. She had been wrong about that in some ways. She would learn she had been wrong in many ways, but that was further down the line. On the third day of the train, somewhere east of the Mississippi, an old woman in widow's black sat down across from her in the dining car. The old woman was named Eulalia Pemberton. She was 70 if she was a day, and her hands were knotted with the labor of a long life, and her eyes were the kind of bright pale blue that had clearly been looking at the world for a long while and had decided to keep looking. She asked Adelaide where she was bound. Adelaide told her. The old woman set down her teacup so slowly and so carefully that the saucer did not make a sound. The Maddox place, she said, out of Silver Creek. Yes, ma'am, child, said Eulalia Pemberton. Did the letter tell you there was just the one of them? I beg your pardon. There are three of them, child. There are three Maddox men up that mountain, brothers, have been since the war. There is the eldest, the one who writes the letters. There is a middle one, quieter than a held breath. And there is a young one with a temper and a fast hand. And nobody in Silver Creek has rightly known what goes on up that mountain in 15 years only, that nobody who needs help and finds them is ever turned away, and nobody who comes up with bad intentions ever comes back down. Adelaide had gone very still. She held her teacup with both hands, and she felt the warm porcelain through her gloves, and she felt the train rocking on the rails beneath her, and she felt the slow, cold turning of something in the bottom of her stomach. The letter, she said, did not say. No, said Eulalia Pemberton. I expect it would not have. The old woman reached across the small table and laid her gnarled hand over Adelaide's. The grip was very gentle and very firm at the same time. You listen to me, child. I have lived in this country my whole long life. I have seen good men, and I have seen bad men, and I have learned that the look of a man on the outside is a poor coin to spend. You watch their hands. You watch what their hands do when they are not thinking about being watched. A bad man's hands give him away. So do a good man's. You watch theirs. You will know. Adelaide had nodded. She had not slept that night nor the next. By the time the train delivered her to a junction in Kansas, and a stagecoach delivered her 3 more days west, and the stagecoach delivered her at last to the wooden platform at Silver Creek. She had read her letter so many more times that she could close her eyes and see the square, certain handwriting against the dark of her eyelids. I cannot promise you a soft life. I can promise you that you will not be cold. She had stepped down from the stage into a wind that was already telling her the second part of that promise was going to be the hardest one to keep. Now on the platform in the failing light, with 3 men standing in front of her where the letter had told her there would be, one Adelaide Whitfield felt the old woman's words come back to her. Watch their hands. She could not help it. She looked. Silas Maddox kept his hands at his sides. They were broad and weathered, and there was a fine network of small white scars across the knuckles of the right one, the kind of scars a man got from years of hard work and from at least one fight he had not entirely won. The left hand was relaxed. The right hand was relaxed. They did not move toward her. They did not move toward the gun on his hip. They simply waited for her to speak. Hollis Maddox had his hands folded one over the other in front of him, the way a man might stand at a graveside. There was a thin gold ring on the smallest finger of his left hand. She could not tell whose ring it had been. Wyatt Maddox kept his right hand on the butt of his pistol, but he was not looking at her with that hand. He was watching the tree line behind the depot the way a man watches a place he has been ambushed from before. Ma'am, Silas said, and his voice was quieter than the wind. I owe you the truth standing right here on this platform before you set foot in any wagon of mine. The letter I sent you was written by me. I meant every word of it, but the cabin is mine and my brother's. We three live there together, and we have done since our mother's bearing in the year 64 and our father's bearing in the year 72. The cabin is not big. There is one room I sleep in and one my brothers share, and a third we kept empty for a long time without rightly knowing why. That third room will be yours. Hollis will move his things in with Wyatt. I will sleep in the barn through the winter. No man under that roof, including me, will come to your door unless you open it. You have my word on that, and you have my brother's word, or you do not have me at all. He paused. The wind moved the brim of his hat. He went on, you have until first light tomorrow to choose. If you choose to go back, I will buy your ticket east myself, and I will not ask you for the 50 I sent. If you choose to stay, then we will go to the church in Silver Creek when the snows allow, and we will speak the words, and you will be my wife in the eyes of God in Colorado territory both. Either way, you are not stuck here. Either way, you are not owed to me. The choice is yours, Miss Whitfield. It was always going to be yours. She had been ready for many things on that platform. She had been ready for cruelty. She had been ready for the sort of tender lying that men used on young women they intended to harm. She had not been ready for the plain, blunt honesty of a man telling her she could leave. She found that her throat had closed. And if I stay through the winter, she said, and find I cannot bear it. What then? Then come spring, he said, I take you to the train myself, and the money. Yours, all of it, the 50 I sent, the rest I owe. You take it east, and you start again. Wyatt Maddox made a small sound in the back of his throat. It was not approval. He did not say anything. Hollis put a hand on Wyatt's shoulder briefly, and Wyatt subsided. All right, Adelaide said. I will ride with you to the cabin tonight. I will give you my answer at first light as you ask. Silas nodded once. He turned to her trunk. He lifted it as if it were not the heaviest thing in her life, as if it were a sack of feed, and he carried it to the wagon and he set it in the bed. And he turned and offered her his hand. She watched the hand. The hand was steady. The hand did not reach. It only waited. She put her gloved fingers in his palm, and he helped her up to the bench, and she felt for the first time in 3 months something that was not quite fear and was not quite hope, but was a small thing turning over between the two of them, looking for a place to lie down. The road up to the cabin was 10 miles of climbing. The wind came harder as they went, and the pine trees stood up dark on either side of the wagon road, and somewhere far off a wolf called once and went silent. Hollis rode ahead of the wagon on a tall sorrel horse. Wyatt rode behind watching the trees. Silas drove the team, and he did not speak for the first 3 miles, and Adelaide did not press him. When at last he spoke, he said only, cold tonight. Yes, she said. Worse before it gets better, I have been told. He glanced at her. The dark had come down around them, and there was only the small lantern on the side of the wagon, and his face was half in light and half in shadow. Where you come from, ma'am, when a thing is hard? What is it you do? She thought about that for a long moment. I work, she said. I work until it is done or until I am. He nodded slowly. He turned his eyes back to the road. That'll do, he said. That'll do up here just fine. The cabin sat in a clearing on the shoulder of a mountain with a barn behind it, and a stand of aspen running down to a creek that even in October moved fast and dark. There was lamplight in the front window. As the wagon came up the rise, the door of the cabin opened, and a small figure stood in the rectangle of warm light, and a voice called out, high and uncertain, Mr. Silas, did you bring her? Did you bring the lady? Brought her, Toby, Silas said. Get on back inside, it's cold. The boy did not get back inside. He stood in the doorway and watched the wagon come the last of the way, and when it stopped, Adelaide could see him plainly. He could not have been more than 12. He was thin in the way that a sick child is thin, with hollows under his eyes and a flush of fever still in his cheeks. He had a wool blanket around his shoulders, and his bare feet were on the coal boards of the porch. and he was looking at her as though she were the first new thing he had seen in a very long time. "That's Tobias Hartley," Chiwetel said quietly as he climbed down. "Toby mostly. His daddy was my hand. Got himself killed by a falling fence post in '77. The boy has been ours since." "Ours," Adelaide repeated softly. "Mine and the boy's," Silas said. "We three signed his papers." She looked again at the boy in the doorway. She looked at the way he held the blanket. She looked at the way his eyes had not left her face. She climbed down from the wagon without taking Silas's hand, and she crossed the yard, and she came up the porch steps, and she knelt down on the cold boards in her crimson dress so that her face was level with the boy's face. "Hello, Tobias Hartley," she said. "Hello, ma'am," he said. "Are you the man of this house? Mr. Silas is." "All right. Are you the second man of this house?" He thought about this. He looked very serious. "Mr. Hollis says I am the spare," he said. "Then I will need to be very careful to be polite to you, won't I?" The boy considered her, then slowly the corner of his mouth went up. It was not quite a smile. It was the early version of one. "You talk pretty," he said. "I am from Boston." "Where is that? A long way from here. Are you going to live with us?" She felt Silas standing behind her in the dark. She felt the cold coming up off the porch boards through the thin fabric of her dress. She felt her own breath in her chest. "I do not know yet, Tobias," she said. "I will know in the morning." He nodded gravely. He stepped back from the door. He held it open for her as if he had been raised in a house with a butler and not in a one-room miner's shack high in the Colorado Rockies. "You best come in then, ma'am. It is cold out." Inside the cabin was larger than she had expected and warmer, and it smelled of pine smoke and leather and cooking grease and the faint clean smell of gun oil. A great stone hearth took up one wall, and a fire burned low in it, and above the hearth hung a rack of antlers wide enough to be the framework of a small boat. A long pine table ran down the center of the main room with 4 hand-carved chairs around it, and at the far end stood of all things an upright piano. The piano was old. Its veneer was split along one side, but it had been polished and its keys were clean. Adelaide stopped in the middle of the room and looked at the piano for a long moment. "That is yours," Silas said behind her. It was not a question. "I beg your pardon. The piano, I bought it at auction in Denver last spring. I did not know who I was buying it for. I knew I was buying it for someone." She turned to look at him. He was standing in the doorway with her trunk in his arms, and the firelight was on his face, and she found she could not speak for a moment. "It is out of tune," he said. "I did not know how to fix that." "I know how to fix that," she said. He nodded as though that settled some long argument he had been having with himself, and he carried her trunk down the short hallway and set it inside the third room, the room that had stood empty without rightly knowing why. He came back without it. He did not look at her again that night. He spoke briefly to his brothers and to Toby, and he took a wool bedroll down from a peg by the door, and he went out across the yard to the barn. Adelaide had ate stew with Hollis and Wyatt and Toby at the long pine table. The stew was venison and potatoes and onion and something green she did not recognize. Hollis had made it. Hollis, it turned out, was the cook. He told her this with a quiet, small smile, and he ladled an extra portion into her bowl without asking her if she wanted it, and she found that she did want it, and she ate. Wyatt did not speak through the meal. He watched her over the rim of his coffee cup. When she met his eyes, he did not look away. When she did not meet them, she could feel them on her anyway. He was not undressing her with that look. He was measuring her. He was deciding how much trouble she was going to be. After supper, Toby was put to bed in the loft. Hollis cleared the table. Adelaide went to her own room. The room had a narrow bed, a small chest of drawers, a washstand with a clean white pitcher, and a single window that looked out across the yard to the barn. There was a kerosene lamp on the chest. There was a quilt on the bed that had been mended many times by a hand that had not been particularly skilled, but had been very patient. She closed the door. She sat down on the edge of the bed. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had not yet given herself permission to cry, but she sat with her face in her hand for a long while, and she let her shoulders shake, and she let her breath go ragged, and she let herself be, for the first time in 3 months, simply terrified. When she lifted her head, she crossed the room to the window. The barn stood across the yard, low and dark, with a single warm seam of light around the edge of the door where the lantern was lit inside. She could see very faintly the shape of a tall man moving in that light. Silas Maddox making up a bedroll in his own barn so that a stranger from Boston could have his roof over her head. She watched him for a long time. She heard faintly through the thin board wall behind her the voices of his two brothers in the kitchen. They were keeping their voices low, but the cabin was old, and the boards had warped, and her hearing was good. "You should have told her about Crane in the letter," Wyatt said. "In what letter, brother?" That was Hollis, wary patient. "How do you write that down?" "Dear Miss, before you come up the mountain to be my brother's wife, I should mention there is a man down in Silver Creek who has been trying to take this land off us for 6 years, and we owe him $500 by spring, and if we cannot pay it, he will take the land and probably try to take you with it." You write it just like that. He wrote her honest. He wrote her about us. That was the part he could write. A long pause. "She is too small for this country," Wyatt said. "You said that about the boy, too. The boy is still here. The boy is a child. She is not." "No," Hollis said. "She is something else. I have been watching her tonight. So have you. So has Silas, though he will not say it. Did you see her go down on her knees on those boards for Toby? Did you see how she did that?" "I saw." "Then quit talking." Wyatt made a small, disapproving sound again. There was the scrape of a chair. There were boots on boards. The voices stopped. In her room, Adelaide stood at the window and pressed her forehead lightly against the cold glass and watched the seam of light around the barn door. The wind picked up. Somewhere out on the dark mountain, a wolf called, and another answered it, and then the silence came down again, the way a heavy blanket comes down. She thought of her uncle's house in Boston. She thought of the gaslight that never reached the upper floors. She thought of her mother's ring against her skin under her dress. She thought of Eulalia Pemberton's pale blue eyes. "Watch their hands, child." She thought of Silas Maddox's hands, the way they had not reached for her, the way they had only waited. She thought of the boy on the porch with the blanket around his shoulders and the fever still in his cheeks, asking her if she was going to live with them. Across the yard, the light in the barn went out. Silas was lying down to sleep in the cold on his own land, in his own barn, because of a promise he had made to a woman he did not yet know. She thought then the thought she had been refusing to think since she had stepped down off the stagecoach. She thought, "I do not have to leave in the morning." She thought, "I could choose to stay." She thought, "I could choose." It was the first time in 7 years that any sentence in her head had begun with those words. She turned the sentence over in her hands like an unfamiliar coin. She did not yet know what it would buy. She did not yet know the price of it. She lay down on the narrow bed in her crimson dress, and she pulled the patient-mended quilt up to her chin, and outside the mountain wind began to rise. Somewhere in the deep timber, a tree gave up under the weight of the early snow and came down with a long, slow crack. Somewhere in the barn, a man she had met that very afternoon turned over in his bedroll and listened to that same tree fall and thought idly that the snow was coming earlier this year than he had hoped. The mountain did not care about either of them, yet. Outside her window, a single thin line of moonlight reached down through a tear in the cloud cover, and it lay across the yard between the cabin and the barn like a strand of silver thread laid on dark cloth. And Adelaide Whitfield, who had stepped off a train into nothing, who had been sold by her own uncle to settle a card debt, who had been told by a wise old woman to watch the hands of strangers, fell asleep at last, with her gloved hand curled against her cheek and her mother's ring warm against her skin, and she did not yet know what was buried behind that cabin, and she did not yet know what name she would learn in the cellar before the month was out, and she did not yet know that the longest winter of her life was not the one closing in around her now, but the one waiting for her on the far side of a single decision she would make at first light. In the morning, Silas Maddox would come up from the barn. In the morning, she would meet him on the porch with her answer. And the mountain which did not care would begin to learn her name. The light came up gray and slow over the eastern ridge, and Adelaide Whitfield woke in her crimson dress with the patient mended quilt pulled to her chin and the cold of the cabin pressed against her face like a still hand. She lay for a long moment without moving. She listened. Somewhere beyond the thin board wall, a stove was being fed, and a kettle was being set, and a man was humming very low the first three notes of a song she did not know. The humming stopped. A spoon touched a bowl. The humming began again. She rose. She crossed to the small washstand. She washed her face in water cold enough to make her teeth ache, and she pinned her hair back into something close to order. And she stood in the middle of the small room and laid her gloved hand flat against the door. And she said under her breath in the voice of a woman speaking to herself the way she might once have spoken to a horse, "All right then, all right." She opened the door. She walked down the short hallway. She came out into the main room and she went to the long pine table and she sat down in one of the hand-carved chairs across from Hollis Maddox, who was kneading bread. He looked up. He did not stop kneading. "Morning, ma'am. Mr. Maddox. Hollis, if you'll allow it." Hollis. The boy Tobias was at the far end of the table, bent over a slate drawing, what looked very much like a horse with too many legs. He looked up and gave her the early version of his smile and went back to his horse. Wyatt was not in the room. Through the small window above the sink, she could see him in the yard, splitting wood, the axe coming down with the steady, cold rhythm of a man who used the work to keep himself from saying things. The front door opened. Silas Maddox came in, with the cold riding on his shoulders. He had been up for hours. There was new snow on the brim of his hat, and there was the smell of horse and hay and pine smoke on his coat, and his whiskey-colored eyes met hers across the room and held there, and he did not move from the doorway. "Miss Whitfield, Mr. Maddox, you said you would give your answer at first light." "I did." The room got very still. Hollis stopped kneading. Toby looked up from his slate. Through the window, the steady, cold rhythm of the axe in the yard kept going, and then it too stopped. "I will stay through the winter," Adelaide said. "I will give this place my work and my honest trying. If come the spring I find I cannot bear it, you will take me to the train and I will go east and we will be square. If come the spring I find I can bear it, then we will go to the church in Silver Creek and we will speak the words." "That is my answer, Mr. Maddox." Silas took off his hat. He held it in both hands. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at her and he nodded once. "Then we have an agreement, Miss Whitfield, and it is Silas if you will allow it." "Adelaide, or Della if it suits you better." "My mother called me Della." "Della then." In the yard the axe started again. It sounded different. It sounded like a man who had been waiting to find out which side of a thing he came down on and had now found out. Hollis went back to kneading the bread. Toby went back to his horse with too many legs. Silas put his hat on a peg by the door, and he came to the table and he sat across from her, and he wrapped his big scarred hands around a tin cup of black coffee, and the morning began. That was the first day. There were many days that followed it. The mountain did not care about any of them, but she began slowly to care about the mountain. Hollis taught her how to make sourdough bread. He had been the cook of the Maddox place for 14 years, since the year his mother had died, and he kept a starter in a stoneware crock by the stove that he treated with the quiet reverence other men reserved for their grandfather's pocket watches. He showed her how to feed it. He showed her how to read it. He showed her how a good loaf told you in the rise of it and the smell of it what kind of weather was coming in 3 days. He did not say much while he taught her, but every now and then his small smile would surface like a fish coming up to the underside of clear water, and Adelaide began to understand that Hollis Maddox was the brother who said almost nothing, because he had decided long ago that almost nothing needed saying that could not be said by the work of his hands. Wyatt taught her to shoot. This came as a surprise to her, and as a worse surprise to Wyatt, because Silas had told him at supper one night quietly that any woman who lived on this mountain through the winter was going to want to know how to put a bullet where she meant to put it, and Wyatt had set his jaw and said nothing. And the next morning at first light, he had stood at her bedroom door with a rifle in his hand and said 3 words up, miss. Now, she had thought he would be cruel. He was not cruel, he was something else. He was patient in a way that startled her. He stood her at the back of the cabin where the ground sloped up to a stand of pines, and he set up 3 tin cans on a fallen log, and he showed her how to brace the rifle against her shoulder so the kick would not bruise her collarbone. He showed her how to breathe out as she squeezed. He did not laugh when she missed. He did not even speak. He only walked the cans back to the log when she shot them off and reset them and stepped back and waited. On the 4th morning, she put 3 out of 3 through the cans. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he took the rifle from her hands and slung it over his shoulder, and he said, "All right then," and he walked back to the cabin without another word. She stood in the cold with her hands tingling, and she watched him go, and she understood suddenly and completely that Wyatt Maddox was the brother who said hard things because he was afraid of what would happen to the people he loved if he did not. Silas taught her tracks. This was the strangest of the lessons and the one she came in time to love best. He took her out behind the cabin in the new snow, and he knelt down on one knee and he pointed to a small spray of disturbances in the white. "Coyote," he said. "Female. She passed by an hour ago. Came down off that ridge, going to the creek to drink. She would have a den half a mile that way and 3 pups late born struggling." Adelaide had asked him how he could possibly know any of that. He had looked up at her and he had smiled for the first time since she had met him. A small, slow, private smile, and he had said, "Ma'am, the snow tells you. You only have to learn the language." He taught her the language, day by day. He taught her how a fox track differed from a dog's. He taught her to read the bend of a young pine and know the weight of the snow it had carried. He taught her that a single feather in a clearing with no body told one story, and a single feather in a clearing with 3 drops of frozen blood told another. He spoke more outdoors than he ever did inside. The mountains seemed to give him permission to use his voice. She listened and she learned, and she found that she could not always remember at the end of a day what they had spoken about, only that they had walked and that he had been within arm's reach of her, and that when she had stumbled once in a deep drift, his hand had come down on her elbow to steady her, and had let go again at once, and had not lingered, and that the place on her sleeve where his glove had been had felt warm to her for the rest of the afternoon. She gave them what she had to give. She taught Toby his letters and his sums and the names of countries he would never see. She mended a tear in Weist's coat and a tear in Hollis's shirt, and she did not mention the mending, only laid the garments back where she had found them. She tuned the piano with a small steel key Hollis produced without comment from a drawer he had not known existed, and on the 7th evening she sat down at the keys and played Beautiful Dreamer, the song her mother had played for her on summer evenings in Boston a lifetime ago. And the 4 men in the cabin went very still, the way men in a country church will go still at a hymn that finds an old wound. When she was done, Wyatt was the first to moan. He stood up from the table. He went outside. He did not slam the door. He closed it carefully behind him. Hollis cleared his throat. Toby was looking at her with his mouth open. Silas had not moved. He was sitting in his chair with both hands flat on the table in front of him, and the firelight was on his face, and there was something working behind his eyes that he did not let come up to the surface. "That was a fine thing, Della," he said quietly. "That was a fine thing to bring into this house." She smiled. She did not trust her own voice. Later that night, when she went to draw water from the kitchen pump, she heard them. She had not meant to. The cabin was old. The boards had warped. The voices came through the wall the way voices do in a house where 3 men have been keeping their hard conversations quiet for a long time. It was Wyatt's voice first. "You have to tell her, Silas, before she gets too far in, before she starts thinking this is a place she can love. You owe her that. Tell her what exactly." "You know what? About Crane, about the 500, about the fact that come spring there is a man down in Silver Creek who is going to ride up this road with paper in one hand and gun hands at his back and try to take this place out from under us. You tell her now and she has time to choose. She has time to take that train. You wait, brother, and she will be in the middle of something she did not sign for. She signed for me, Wyatt. She signed for the man in the letter, not the man with a creditor and a past. A long silence. Then Hollis quiet weary. He is right, Silas. Not about all of it, but about the telling. I know he is right. Then, then I will tell her, when the time is right, not tonight, not while the music is still in the room. And Crane. Crane is mine. Crane has been mine for 6 years. You boys will not lift a hand on him while I draw breath. It will not be your hand he comes for first, brother. Not anymore. You have brought a woman onto this mountain. He will come for her if he thinks it gets him the deed. I know what he will do. I have known what he would do since the day I wrote the letter. I have not been a fool about this. I have only been late. The voices went quiet. Adelaide stood at the pump with the water bucket in her hand and her heart beating somewhere she could not quite locate, high in her throat, low in her belly. She set the bucket down on the floor very carefully so it would not slosh, so they would not hear, and she went back to her room and closed her door and stood with her back against the door and waited until she could hear herself think. A man named Crane, a debt of $500. A spring she had not yet seen, and a road up the mountain she did not yet know, and a deed they were trying to keep, and her own name somewhere in the middle of it, in a way she did not yet understand. She did not sleep well that night, but she did not pack her trunk either. Stay with her listener, stay close, because what she does not yet know, sitting in the dark of that room with her back to the door, is that the man named Crane is going to come up that wagon road sooner than the spring. And the secret she will find in the cellar of this cabin will be older and deeper and bloodier than any of them are ready for. If you are listening tonight from a porch or a kitchen or a workshop, drop me a line in the comments. Tell me what you think she should have done standing in that hallway with the bucket in her hand. Now back to the cabin, back to the dark, back to Della. In the morning, she went to the kitchen and she put on Hollis's apron, which was much too big for her, and she rolled up her sleeves and she said, "All right, Hollis Maddox, today you teach me how to read your starter." And Hollis, who saw her face and did not ask, taught her how to read his starter, and the day went on. It was 3 nights later that she saw the wound. She had gotten up in the small hours for water, and the lamp in the kitchen was burning low, and Silas was sitting at the table with his shirt off down to the waist, and a clean white cloth pressed against his right shoulder, and another clean white cloth in a basin of pink water at his elbow. He did not see her. He was working alone the way he did most things, with a slow, stubborn competence and a face set against the small, private fact of pain. She stopped in the hallway shadow. She saw the new wound. It was a long, ragged gash across the meat of his shoulder, the kind of gash a man got from a falling spar of timber, or from being thrown from a horse against a fence wire, and it had been bleeding fresh until very recently. He had taken a needle and a length of catgut from a tin on the table, and he was stitching it himself. His jaw set his offhand brace flat against the table to keep his arm steady. She saw the old wounds, too. She could not help it. There were many. There was the long, pale rope of a knife scar across his ribs. There was a small, puckered round mark high on the left side of his chest, the kind a bullet leaves when it has gone clean through and met no bone. There was a longer mark down low on the right side, the kind a bullet leaves when it has not. There were others, smaller, older. She counted 7 before she stopped counting. He had carried these on his body for years, and he had not spoken of any of them, and he was sitting alone in his own kitchen at 3 in the morning, sewing up a new one rather than wake any of them. She stepped back into the hallway shadow. She did not let him see her. She did not that night go to the pump. She went back to her room and lay on her narrow bed in the dark, and she held her mother's ring between her fingers on its chain, and she thought the man is sitting alone out there because he has been alone with these wounds for so long. He does not know any other way to be with them. And she thought the man wrote me a letter, and he said in the letter that no one would be cold, and he is sitting in his own kitchen at 3 in the morning, bleeding into a basin so as not to wake the rest of us. It was the next afternoon that Wyatt burned the bread. He had been left in charge of the loaves while Hollis was out at the woodpile. Hollis had given him very simple instructions. Wyatt had ignored them. He had been trying to read a letter from a Denver paper that had come up in the supply wagon, and he had let the loaves go far past the point of saving. And the kitchen had filled with a smell that was at first alarming, and then after a beat, hilarious. Hollis came in from the woodpile and stopped in the doorway and did not say a word for a full 10 seconds. Then he said very quietly, "Wyatt Maddox, you burned my bread. It is not burned. It is the color of the inside of a stove, brother. It is past burned. It is on its way to becoming a separate substance." Toby was already laughing. Toby was laughing so hard he had to sit down on the floor. Adelaide was holding the back of a chair with both hands, trying not to laugh and laughing anyway. Silas had come in behind Hollis, and he was looking at the bread with the same grave expression he had used to read coyote tracks in the snow, and that somehow was the funniest thing of all. "It has," Silas said slowly, "a structural quality." "It has a what?" Wyatt said. "You could build with it." "You could not build with it. You could pave with it then. Lay it flat. Drive a wagon over it." Hollis was wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Adelaide could not see for laughing. Wyatt looked from one of them to the other, and his face went through several arrangements, and finally it settled on the small, reluctant grin of a young man who has been ambushed gently by his own family. "All right," he said. "All right, I am bad at the bread." "You are bad at the bread," Silas said. Della Wyatt said, "If I teach you a second piece of marksmanship, will you teach me how to keep an eye on a loaf?" "I will," she said. She was still wiping her eyes. "I will teach you bread, Wyatt Maddox." It was the first time she had used his name without the mister. He noticed. Everyone noticed. No one said anything. Hollis took the loaves outside to the chickens, and the chickens in time would also reject them. That night by the fire, after Toby had been put up to the loft, Silas came and sat in the chair across from her, and he did not pretend to be doing anything else. He had a tin cup of coffee. She had a tin cup of tea. The fire had burned down to good red coals. Hollis was at the table with a pencil sketching something. Wyatt had gone to the barn to check on a mare. Silas said, without preamble, "My mother died in '64. The cholera came up the wagon road and found us before the spring. Pa held on to her for 2 days. He buried her himself behind the cabin under the aspens. I was 18. Hollis was 16. Wyatt was 14. Pa was never the same man after that." She held very still. "Pa raised us 4 more years, and then he sent me to the Rangers in Texas. He thought it would put steel in me. He was not wrong. It put steel in me. It put other things in me too. Things I have spent the last 10 years trying to set down. There was an incident at a place called Brazos Crossing in the year '69. We were running down a bandit crew that had killed a coach driver and 3 passengers. There was a man at the river. The light was bad. There was steam coming up off the water. He raised his arms, and I read the gesture wrong. I shot him. He had been raising his hands to surrender. He was not a bandit. He was a homesteader who had come down to the river to draw water at the wrong hour of the wrong morning. I shot him through the chest, and he lived for about 2 minutes, and he asked me before he went to tell his wife. I had to find his wife. I had to tell her. I left the Rangers the same week. I came home to Colorado. Pa was already sick by then. He went 3 years later. After that, it was just us 3 in this place." He paused. He turned the tin cup in his hands. "I have not told that story to a living soul outside this cabin. I am telling you because you are sitting at my table in good faith, and you have a right to know what is sitting across from you. I have killed a man who did not deserve to die. I have lived with that for 10 years. I will live with it for the rest of my life." She set down her cup. She reached across the small space between them. She laid her hand over his. His hand was warm. The scars on the knuckles were rough under her palm. "Silas Maddox," she said, A good man is not a man who has done no wrong. A good man is a man who has done wrong and has carried it and has chosen every day after to do right. You have raised your two brothers from boys. You have taken in the son of a man who worked for you. You have written an honest letter to a woman you did not know, and you have kept every word of that letter. You are a good man. I do not say it lightly. I say it because it is the truth, and I have seen enough of the other kind to know the difference. He did not answer her with words. He turned his hand over under hers, and he laced his rough fingers through her smaller ones slowly, as if he were giving her every chance to take her hand away. She did not take her hand away. They sat like that for a long, quiet time while the fire burned down, and Hollis at the table pretended very hard to be sketching, and outside the wind moved through the aspens with a sound like a long, slow breath. Winter always ends, Della, he said at last. I do not know much. I know that. Yes, she said, and the wounds in time do close. Yes, he let her hand go. He stood. He took both their cups to the basin. He went to his bedroll on the floor by the door because 2 nights before the snows had thickened enough that he had finally agreed to sleep inside the cabin instead of the barn, and he laid down with his back to the room, and he did not move again for a long time. Adelaide sat by the fire alone. She watched the coals. She thought about her bedroom door. She had locked it her first 6 nights in the cabin, bolted it, set a chair against it. She had stopped bolting it after the first week, and she had stopped setting the chair after the second. That night, she did not even close it all the way. She did not know what that meant. She thought in the morning perhaps Silas would understand without her having to say it. She slept. The wind moved on the mountain. The mountain went on not caring, but it was learning her name now. Slowly, the way mountains learn things. The way old things learn the names of new things that have come to live among them. The mountain and the man down in Silver Creek, and the past on a Texas river, and the buried bones of a father in a quiet grave in the Aspens, all of these were turning slowly toward a single point they could not yet see. The first hard snow of true winter was 3 days out. The man with the deed in his hand was 3 weeks out. The truth about why a father had been put into the ground in 72 was buried in a cellar 12 feet from where Adelaide Whitfield slept that night, in a room with a door that was for the first time in her life only mostly closed. Outside, somewhere far off down the dark valley, a single rider was waiting on the season to break. His name was Harlan Crane. He had been waiting 6 years. He could wait a little longer. The black carriage came up the wagon road on the last Tuesday of November, and Adelaide Whitfield saw it from the kitchen window, and she set down the bowl of bread dough she had been turning with both hands and went very still. It was a fine carriage. It did not belong in this mountain. The lacquer on it had been kept the way a man keeps a gun he intends to use, and the two black horses pulling it were matched, and they were not breathing hard, which meant whoever owned them had paid a great deal of money to make sure they would not have to. 2 riders flanked the carriage. They sat their saddles the way men sit who have been paid to ride armed, and their coats were too clean for the country. The smaller of the 2 riders sat his saddle in a way that was not quite that of a hired man. He had the same narrow shoulders as the man inside the carriage, and something of the same set to the jaw, though his eyes did not match. He kept those eyes on the cabin door rather than on the windows. He did not that whole long quarter hour on the porch look at his elder once. Silas, Adelaide said. Her voice came out steady. It surprised her. There is a carriage coming up the road. He was at the table with Hollis going over the supply ledger. He looked up. He looked once at her face and once out the window, and he stood without hurry. He took his coat down from the peg. He took his pistol belt down from the peg beside it. Wyatt he called mild as a man calling a dog. Yard. Wyatt came in from the back of the cabin already buckling his belt. Hollis closed the ledger and set it on the shelf and took up the long rifle by the door. None of them ran. None of them spoke. They moved the way they had once moved during the war before any of them had been on this mountain, and Adelaide understood watching them that this was not the first carriage that had come up this road, and that the 3 Maddox brothers had between them a particular grammar for such arrivals. You stay inside, Delasilas said. He did not look at her when he said it. He was watching the road. You stay inside and you keep Toby with you, and you do not come out no matter what is said on the porch. Will you do that for me? Yes, she said. Thank you. He went out. The brothers went with him. The carriage stopped 20 feet short of the porch. The driver did not climb down. The two riders did not dismount. The carriage door opened, and a man in a long white coat stepped out into the snow, and Adelaide, standing back from the kitchen window, with Tobias pressed against her hip, saw Harlan Crane for the first time. He was a slight man. He was not tall. He had a banker's narrow shoulders and a small, careful mouth, and his hair was the color of old straw under a clean black hat. And the white coat he wore was the kind a man wore in this country when he wanted you to remember every minute he stood in front of you that he did not have to do his own dirty work. He smiled at the brothers. The smile did not reach any other part of his face. From inside the kitchen, Adelaide watched Crane's hands. Eulalia Pemberton had taught her on a moving train that a man's hands give him away. Crane's hands were thin and clean and very still. They did not work. They had never worked. They were the hands of a man who paid other hands to do for him, and that she understood at once was the most dangerous kind of hand a man could have. Mr. Maddox, gentlemen, I trust the season finds you well. Crane, I had heard a rumor in town. I confess I did not believe it. A wife, a Boston wife no less. I had to come and see for myself. Say what you came to say. I came to discuss the note, Mr. Maddox. The note is due the 1st of April. I am in town and you are up here, and I thought a courtesy call ahead of the spring would save us both some unpleasantness. $500 plus the interest at the agreed rate comes to $640. Cash, Mr. Maddox, or the deed. You will have your money on the 1st of April. Will I? You will. Crane let his small, careful smile move across the porch and through the doorway and into the kitchen, where it came to rest for one heartbeat on Adelaide Whitfield, who was standing back from the window in her crimson dress with the boy against her hip. Then the smile went back to Silas. Or Mr. Maddox, or there is another arrangement, and I think we are gentlemen enough to discuss it. The young lady is, I am told, not yet your wife. The marriage has not been spoken at the church. She is in the eyes of the law a guest in your house. I am a widower. I am by the standards of this territory a man of comfortable means. I would be willing to take the note off your hands and the young lady off your hands in a single transaction. She would live in town. She would have a parlor and a piano and a paid girl to do the heavier work. She would not freeze on a mountain, and she would not be buried at 24 under 5 feet of Colorado dirt. And you would keep your land. Think on it. Wyatt's hand went to his pistol. Silas's hand caught his brother's wrist before the pistol cleared the leather. Silas did not look at Wyatt. Silas looked at Crane. You will leave my land now, Mr. Crane. You will leave it under your own power and on your own time. And you will not speak of the woman in my house again in this life in my hearing, or you and I will have a different conversation. Crane inclined his head, the small, courtly nod of a man who has just been told a price and intends to pay it later when he is buying. April 1st, Mr. Maddox, $640. Cash, or the deed, or the other arrangement. Good day. He climbed back into the carriage. The carriage turned in the yard and went back down the wagon road. The two riders followed. The smaller one looked back just once at the cabin door with an expression Adelaide could not quite read at that distance. None of the Maddox brothers moved until the last of them was out of sight in the trees. Then Wyatt said in a voice that was not loud but was not steady, I will kill him, Silas. I will kill him on the open road, and I will say it was wolves. You will not. He came here. He came here, and he looked at her like that, and you let him ride out. I let him ride out because the alternative was him not riding out and a marshal up from Denver in a month, and the three of us hanged before the snow melted. I let him ride out because that is what a man does who intends to win the long fight. You will not lay a hand on him. You will not put a bullet near him. You will leave him to me. A long silence on the porch, then very low, Hollis. She heard all of that, brother. I know she did. You are going to have to tell her now. I know I am. Pause here, listener. Take a breath with her. The man who came up that road in the white coat has just put a price on her. The same way her uncle put a price on her. The same way every man who has ever looked at her has put a price on her. And she is, for the first time in her life, in a house full of men who will not pay it. If this story is finding you tonight, tap that like button and tell me down in the comments where you are. The next hour is the hardest hour of her life, and yours and Silas Maddox's, and I want you with us when it comes. Now, back to the cabin, back to the table where her hands are folded. She was sitting at the long pine table when he came in. Tobias was in the loft. She had sent him up with a slate and a stub of chalk and instructions she could not afterward recall having spoken. Her hands were folded in front of her on the table. They were perfectly still. Silas closed the door. He hung up his coat. He sat down across from her. He laid both his big, scarred hands flat on the wood between them. I owe you a longer story than the one I have told you so far, Della. Yes, I will tell it now. He told her. He told her about the $500 note taken 6 years ago against the land in a season where two of the brothers had been laid up sick and the herd had been thin, and a man had to feed his family and his hands and pay the territory's tax or lose the place. He told her how Harlan Crane had been the only man in Silver Creek with the cash to lend. He told her how Crane had wanted the deed from the day the ink dried, and how every legal maneuver Crane had tried in 6 years had been blocked, and how the spring of '79 was the last good chance Crane would have, because a railway survey was coming through the valley, and the land with its water rights was about to be worth 10 times what it had been when the loan was written. She listened. She did not interrupt. When he was done, she said, "That is not the whole of it." "No, tell me the rest." "The rest is that when my pa died in '72, we put it down as a hunting accident. He was found at the foot of a draw half a mile from the cabin with his rifle near him and his horse standing over him. We told the law it was a fall. It was easier. We were 3 young men with a place to keep, and a story like that ends, and a story like the truth does not. The truth is, Della, that the day before my father died, he had ridden into Silver Creek, and he had gone into Crane's office, and he had quarreled with Crane in front of 2 clerks. The clerks would not say afterward what the quarrel had been about. My father came home that night, and he sat at this table, and he told me, 'Son, I have been a fool about a thing, and I am going to set it right in the morning.' He did not get the chance. The next afternoon, he was found in the draw. You think Crane killed him? I have thought it for 7 years. I have not been able to prove it. I have not been able to find what they quarreled about. I have looked. I have not found." She nodded slowly. She unfolded her hands. She stood. She crossed the room to the cellar door, and she opened it, and she went down the narrow steps. He followed her. He had to bend almost double under the low beams. She lit the lantern that hung at the foot of the stairs. She turned. She looked at him in the small yellow light of the cellar with the smell of root vegetables and old dust around them. And she said, "I have been meaning to show you this for 9 days. I did not know how. Now I know how." She crossed to the back wall of the cellar. There was a stack of wine racks there, 3/4 empty, and behind the third rack, set into the stone of the wall, a loose brick. She drew the brick out. She reached into the cavity. She drew out a tin box. "I was looking for a jar of preserves my second week here," she said. "I knocked the rack with my elbow. The brick moved. I should have told you the same hour. I did not. I was afraid. I am sorry." She set the tin on top of the rack. She opened it. Inside were letters, perhaps a dozen, tied in a packet with old twine. The top letter was addressed in a hand she did not know to a man called only ZM at a Silver Creek postbox that had been closed for years. The signature on the bottom of the 10th letter was a single initial, HC. Silas did not move for a long count. Then he reached out and he took the packet and he untied the twine and he read the top letters standing in the cellar with the lantern light yellow on his face. Then he read the second, then the third. By the fourth, he had to sit down on a crate. He read all 12. When he was done, he laid the packet flat on the lid of the tin and pressed both hands against it and bowed his head and did not speak for a long time. Crane and my father were partners in a silver claim up in the high country, he said at last. Before any of this, before the loan, they found a vein together in '69, the year I was at Brazos. They were working it quiet off the book because the survey would have taken half of it for the territory. My father got cold feet. He told Crane in '72 that he meant to go to the assay office and file it clean and pay the tax and be square with the territory and with God. Crane told him that would ruin both of them. They quarreled. My father went home. The next day, my father was dead at the foot of a draw. He looked up. His face in the lantern light was the face of a man who has finally been handed, after 7 years, a thing he has been reaching for in the dark. Crane killed him, Della. Crane killed my father. And Crane has been trying to take this land for 6 years, not because he wants the water rights, though. He wants those too. He has been trying to take it because the entrance to that silver vein is somewhere on this land. My father knew where. My father was the only one who knew where. And my father took it with him into the ground. She came to the crate. She sat down beside him. She put her hand on his back between his shoulder blades, and she felt a long shudder go through him, the kind of shudder a man tries not to let out for years and finally does. We will find it, she said. We will find what your father knew. There will be a record somewhere. A man who quarreled with his partner and then wrote out the location of a silver vein the night before he died is a man who left a record. We will find it, and we will give it to the law, and Crane will hang for what he did. Della, yes, you should not be in the middle of this. You came up this mountain for a husband. You did not come up it for a war. Silas Maddox, she said, I came up in this mountain because a man wrote me a letter that said no one under his roof would be cold. I have read that letter so many times the paper is worn through. I am under your roof. So is your fight. So is your father's name. They are mine now too. I will not stand outside of them. He looked at her. He did not speak. He took her smaller hand in his big scarred one and he held it, and they sat in the cellar a while longer, and the lantern burned low. And upstairs in the cabin, the wind began very faintly to rise. 2 days later, it had become a storm. By dusk, on the third day, it was a blizzard, the like of which no one in the cabin had seen in 11 years. The pines bent under the weight of the snow. The barn door had to be braced against the drifts every 2 hours. The mercury in the small thermometer outside the kitchen window dropped past the figures it was made to hold and went on dropping into the unmarked place below. And on the second night of the blizzard, Tobias Hartley began to cough up blood. It came in small, bright flecks at first. He was at the table eating broth, and he coughed once into his sleeve, and Adelaide, watching him, said very calmly, Toby, show me your sleeve, child. He showed her. The flecks were on the wool, small and red and unmistakable. She felt his forehead. He was burning. He had been hiding the fever for a day and a half because he had not wanted to be a bother. She picked him up. She carried him into her own bed because it was the warmest in the cabin. She stripped off his outer shirt and put him under 3 blankets, and she sent Hollis for Cold Creek water, and she sent Wyatt for the small leather case of medicines they kept in the chest by the door. The leather case had aspirin. It had a small bottle of laudanum. It had peppermint oil. It did not have what the boy needed. The boy needed a doctor's tincture, the kind that came in a brown glass bottle from a pharmacy in a town, and the only town was Silver Creek. And Silver Creek was 40 miles down a wagon road, buried in 5 feet of new snow with the storm still coming. Silas was already pulling on his coat. No, Adelaide said. Della. No, Silas. You will not make it. No man could make it. You will die on the road, and Toby will die in this bed, and I will have buried 2 of you in 1 week. Wait the storm out. Wait. He does not have until the storm passes. Then we will pray harder. We will warm him. We will steam him. I have seen this in Boston. I know what to do until a doctor can come. We will keep him alive until the road is clear." Silas looked down at the small, flushed face on her pillow. The boy was muttering to himself, half in his sleep, half in the fever. He was saying very softly, "Paw, paw," the way a child says a thing he is dreaming about and not sure of. Silas closed his eyes for one beat, then he opened them. He took her by both shoulders. His hands were gentle. His grip was not. "Della, listen to me. I made a promise to that boy's father at his deathbed in the year 77 that I would raise the boy as my own. I have kept that promise for 18 months. I am not going to lose him in this bed because I was warm in mine. The doctor's tincture is in Silver Creek. I will go and I will get it. I will come back. I am asking you to understand, and I am asking you not to ask me to break the only promise I have ever made to a dying man. Will you do that for me, Della?" She could not speak. She nodded. He kissed her then. It was the first true kiss they had spoken between them, and it was not on her mouth. It was on her forehead, slow and careful, a kiss, the way a man seals a letter he is sending into a country he is not sure he will return from. He held his lips against her skin for one long count, and then he stepped back, and he set his hat on his head, and he went out into the storm. Hollis went with him as far as the barn. Wyatt went with him as far as the gate. After that, only Silas. One man, one horse, one rode 40 miles of white. The cabin shut around the three who remained. Adelaide sat by Tobias all that night, and the next day, and the night after that. She did not sleep. She kept the boy's fever down with cold cloths from the creek water Hollis fetched and refetched. She kept the boy's lungs open with the steam of a kettle she boiled and reboiled with handfuls of pine needles, an old remedy her mother had used in Boston in another century. She prayed under her breath in a voice she did not recognize. She had not prayed in 7 years. She found that the words came back. On the second morning, she went out to the porch alone, and she took from around her neck the gold chain with her mother's wedding ring. She held the ring in her open palm. It was the only thing of her mother's she had carried out of Boston. It was the only thing of her own that her uncle had not been able to sell. She held it up against the white morning, and she said low, "Mama, if you are listening, this is not a payment. This is a promise. Bring him home. Bring them both home. And I will live the rest of my life worth the bringing." She put the ring back around her neck. She went inside. She sat by Toby. She waited. He came back at dusk on the second day. She heard of the horse first. It was barely walking. Hollis had been at the window every quarter hour, and Hollis was the one who saw, and Hollis was the one who went out into the yard with a lantern and was almost knocked down by a man falling out of the saddle into his arms. They carried him in between them, Hollis under one shoulder and Wyatt under the other. His beard was ice solid. His eyebrows were white. His hands were the color of old paper, and there was blood frozen at the knuckles where the rains had cut through his gloves. He was holding against his chest, inside his coat, a small brown bottle wrapped in 3 layers of oilcloth. He gave the bottle to Adelaide. He could not speak. His lips would not shape the words. He looked at her, and he closed his eyes, and he let his brothers lower him onto the bench by the fire. She took the bottle. She measured out the dose with a hand that did not shake. She gave it to Toby. She turned back to Silas. She knelt in front of him. She took off his frozen gloves. She put his hands one at a time into a basin of warm water. She watched the color come back into them, slow as sunrise. She rubbed his arms. She got broth into him, a spoonful at a time. She covered him in every blanket in the cabin. She did not leave his side or Toby's for the next 12 hours. In those 12 hours, the fever broke in the boy, and the color came back into the man, and the storm outside, having done what it came to do, began to slacken. It was deep in the small hours when Silas finally opened his eyes and could speak. The cabin was quiet. The fire was low. Hollis was asleep in the chair by Toby's bed. Wyatt was asleep on the floor with his back against the door, the way a dog sleeps that has decided to guard a thing. Adelaide was sitting on the bench beside Silas with his big rough hand cradled in both of hers. Della, he said. His voice was hoarse. I am here. I have to tell you something. Yes. I did not ride through that storm for the boy. I love that boy. I would have ridden it for him. But that was not why I went. Why then? I went because somewhere on the road around the second hour, I thought of you. I thought if Toby dies in that bed, she will believe she should have done more. She will carry it. I have carried that kind of thing, Della. I would not wish it on a soul, and I will not wish it on yours. And somewhere on that road in the snow, I understood that I would die before I let her carry that. And I understood then that I have not been keeping you in my house out of duty or out of a letter or out of an arrangement. I have been keeping you in my house because you are the first thing in 15 years that has made me feel like a man worth the saving. I do not know how to say it any plainer than that. I am too tired to be careful. She did not answer him with words. She crossed the small space between them and she pressed her forehead to his chest, where the old bullet scar lay above his heart. And she felt his slow breath under her cheek, and she felt his arm come up and gather her in careful stiff. Not yet sure she was real, and she stayed there a long time, and the fire burned, and the cabin held, and the mountain for the first time since the beginning of this story seemed to hold its breath with them. You are home now, Della. You are right where you are supposed to be. He did not say it. He did not have to. She heard it in the slow, steady knock of his heart against her ear, and she answered it in the same silent language with the press of her hand against the front of his shirt, where the blood had dried at the cuff. In the days that followed the storm, while Toby gathered his strength back, and Silas's hands learned again the work they had been built for, Della began to read the letters in the cellar. She read them by lamplight after the men had gone to bed. She read them with a notebook beside her and a pencil in her hand, and she copied out every line in which the word vein appeared, and every line in which a place name appeared, and every line in which a date appeared. She did not yet know what she was looking for. She knew only that men who write letters to other men about silver leave more in those letters than they mean to. Somewhere in the 12 folded pages, her father-in-law had left a thread. She meant to find it. They had agreed once that the church would wait for spring. They did not wait for spring. There are seasons a man and a woman set aside for the keeping of agreements. And there are seasons in which the keeping of agreements is no longer the most important thing they owe one another. This was the second kind. 2 weeks later, on a clear, cold Sunday morning, when the road to Silver Creek had finally opened, they stood up in front of the small white church at the bottom of the valley, and the preacher spoke the words, and Adelaide Whitfield, in her crimson dress, the only fine dress she owned, became Adelaide Maddox. Hollis stood as a witness, Wyatt stood as the other. Tobias Hartley sat in the front pew in a clean white shirt that Hollis had pressed, and a borrowed jacket that was a little too big for his thin shoulders, and he watched the whole thing with a small, grave face, and when the preacher pronounced them, man and wife, the boy stood up all on his own and clapped just once before remembering he was in church. Bridget O'Sullivan, the storekeeper from Silver Creek, who had sold Hollis the flour for the bread, and had sold Adelaide a length of plain wool to men with sat in the back pew and wept openly into a square of clean linen. Sheriff Holloway sat one row behind her in a black suit that did not quite fit him, and watched the proceedings with the faintly puzzled look of a man who had not been to a wedding in a long time and was finding it harder than he had expected. Silas leaned down. He kissed his wife. The kiss was brief and proper, and the church went still around it. Outside, against the white field beyond the windows, the first soft snow of late December began very gently to fall. They went home that afternoon up the wagon road. The bedroom door of the cabin closed behind them at dusk. Outside, the first snow of winter came down quiet and clean over the Colorado mountain, and the lamp in the kitchen burned low, and Hollis Maddox and Wyatt Maddox and Tobias Hartley sat at the long pine table with 3 cups of black coffee and 1 glass of milk, and Hollis said very softly, well, and Wyatt said in a voice that surprised everyone, including himself, I think we did all right by him, brother. I think Pa would say we did all right. Outside the cabin, the snow kept coming, and inside it, the new family kept its first quiet hour. In 40 miles down the valley, in a fine dark room above a bank in Silver Creek, a man in a white coat lit a cigar with a long, careful match and looked at a calendar on his wall and counted the days to the 1st of April. And behind him in the shadow of the room, his younger brother Lucian Crane stood without speaking and watched and waited and did not yet show his hand. The days after the wedding were the kind of quiet days that come to a place after a long fever has broken. Toby was up and walking by the second week of January, thinner than he had been, but with the color back in his cheek, and he had begun to call Silas by a new word, and Silas had begun to answer to it. He did not call him Pa. He called him Pa with the T on the end of it dropped clean the way frontier children call a man who has decided to keep them. Silas had not asked the boy to do it. The boy had simply done it one morning across the breakfast table, and Silas had set down his coffee cup, and he had looked at the boy for a long count, and he had said, "All right, son, pass the salt." And the boy had passed the salt, and the cabin had become in that one small, unspoken transaction a different kind of place. Adelaide kept reading the letters. She read them at night after the men had gone up to bed. She read them with the lamp turned low at the long pine table with the notebook open beside her and the pencil in her hand. She had copied out every line that mentioned the vein. She had copied out every line that mentioned a creek, a draw, a stand of timber, a benchmark. She had laid them all out in columns the way her father, who had been a clerk before the cholera took him, had once taught her to lay out a problem too big to hold all at once in the head. On the 11th night of her reading, she found it. It was not in any of the letters that Crane had signed. It was on the back of one of them in a different end in pencil, faint, almost rubbed away. Her father-in-law had used the back of the letter as a scratch pad the way a thrifty man would, and he had written in the months before he died a list of small numbers in a single line of words. 2 paces north of the lightning aspen, 3 paces east of the second cairn, down through the granite shelf to where the water sounds change. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. She closed the notebook. She went up the stairs to the bedroom she now shared with her husband, and she sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark, and she put her hand on Silas Maddox's shoulder, and she said quietly, "Wake up, husband. I have found your father." He came awake at once the way he always did, all at once, with no in-between. He sat up. He listened to her read it. He listened to her read it twice. He sat in the dark for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "The lightning aspen is the one struck in '80, up by the high meadow. Pa used to take us to it as boys. He said it had been there before any of us and would be there after. I know, the second cairn is the one we built when we buried him." Yes. He went very still then. She felt the still go through him. He hid the entrance of his own claim, he said, on the spot where he expected to be buried. He left his sons a map, and he wrote it where Crane would never look, on the back of Crane's own letter, and he put the second waypoint on his own grave. "He left it for you, Silas," she said. "He knew. The night he came home from Silver Creek, the night before he died, he knew it was coming. And he left it for you to find." Silas put his face in his hands. She held him. She did not say anything else. After a long time, he lifted his head, and he kissed her once on the forehead the way he had kissed her before riding into the storm. And he said, "We ride to the high meadow at first light, all of us, and we bring spades, and we bring rifles." The high meadow in February was a country of white sky and blue snow and silence. They rode up in single file, Silas in front, then Hollis, then Adelaide on the small bay mare Wyatt had taught her, and then Wyatt at the rear with the long rifle across his saddlebow. Toby they had left at the cabin under strict orders not to open the door for any voice he did not know. They had left him with a loaded shotgun across his lap because the boy was 12 years old, and the country he lived in was not Boston, and Adelaide had kissed him on the top of the head and told him she would be back before dark. The lightning aspen stood at the western edge of the meadow, white as bone, its top half blackened where the strike had taken it years before. From there, they paced 2 north and 3 east, and they came to the second cairn. The cairn was the one the brothers had built themselves in the year 72 and stacked stone by stone over their father's grave because the ground had been frozen too hard to dig deep. They moved the stones. They moved them carefully the way men handle the weight of a thing that is more than its weight. Beneath the stones, they did not find a body. They had not expected to. Their father had been buried properly the following spring behind the cabin under the aspens beside their mother. The cairn here was a marker only, a second stone set on a holy place to point to a third. Beneath the cairn in the granite shelf, they found the seam. It was narrow. It was barely the width of 2 hands. Wyatt had to lie flat on his belly in the snow and feel his way down with his arm. And when he came up, his hand was full of a pale dust that when he held it to the gray February light glittered the way silver glitters when it has not yet been touched by a smelter. Hollis sat down hard in the snow. He laughed once short, surprised. He did not say anything. Silas knelt beside the seam. He took a small leather pouch from his coat and filled it with the dust. He sealed it. He stood up. He looked at his wife. "We do not work this claim," he said. "We do not file it. Not yet. This is not money. Not yet. This is evidence. This is what my father quarreled with Crane about. This is what got my father killed. We bring this down off the mountain and we take it to Sheriff Holloway and we take it to the assay office in Denver and we file it clean and we file it true and we name Harlan Crane in a sworn statement and we let the law of the territory do what the law of the territory was made to do. Are we agreed?" "We are agreed," Hollis said. Wyatt did not answer. Wyatt was looking down the meadow eastward toward the wagon road. His face had gone the way it went when he had been ambushed once before and was not going to be ambushed again. Silas, riders. There were 4 of them. They had come up the wagon road slow, the way men come up a road when they do not want to be heard, and they had stopped at the foot of the meadow where the trees open, and they were sitting their horses there in a loose line, and one of them was a man in a clean white coat that did not belong to the country. Silas did not curse. He did not even change expression. He only said quietly, "Mount. Della, with me. Hollis, take the long way. Wyatt, cover." They mounted. They moved. The 4 riders moved too. 2 of them broke off west to cut the trail back to the cabin. The white coat and the smaller rider beside him came straight up the meadow. They were not in any hurry. They knew the meadow had only the one good way out at this end, and they were standing in it. Halfway down the meadow, Silas reined in. Adelaide reined in beside him. Hollis and Wyatt had already disappeared into the trees on the south side the way Silas had told them to. Silas drew his rifle from the saddle scabbard. He laid it across his knees. He looked at his wife. "You ride, Della. You ride south. Hollis will meet you. You take the long way down and you go to Sheriff Holloway and you put this pouch in his hand and you tell him every word of what we found. Do not stop. Do not turn. Do not look back. Silas Maddox, I will not leave you on this meadow with that man." "You will," he said, "because the only way I can do what I have to do is knowing you are riding away from it. You take the boy with you out of Silver Creek if it goes wrong. You take him east. You give him my name, and you give him my land, and you raise him, Della. You raise him. Do you hear me? Promise me." "I will not promise it." "Promise me." She could not speak. She nodded. He leaned across his saddle, and he kissed her once on the mouth, hard fast, the way a man kisses his wife when he is not sure he will get a second one, and he slapped the rump of her mare, and the mare went south at a hard trot, and Adelaide Maddox rode down off the high meadow with the small leather pouch of silver dust against her ribs, and her husband alone behind her in the snow, with a rifle across his knees and 4 armed men coming up to meet him. She rode hard. Hollis met her at the South Fork as he had said he would. They did not speak. They rode together down off the shoulder of the mountain by the long way the way Silas had taught her in their walks together, the way that no man unfamiliar with the land would think to look. They did not see Wyatt. They did not see the four riders. They heard once far behind them and above them the dry, cold crack of a single rifle shot. They did not slow. They did not stop. They did not look back. They came down into Silver Creek at full dark, and they went straight to Sheriff Holloway's office, and Adelaide put the pouch on his desk, and she put the packet of letters beside it, and she said, "Sheriff, my husband is alone on the high meadow with Harlan Crane and 3 men. I want you to ride. Now. And I am riding with you." Sheriff Holloway was a slow man. He was slow the way oak trees are slow. He looked at the pouch. He opened the top letter. He read it. He read the second. He stood up. He took down a coat from a peg. He took down a rifle from a rack. He looked at Bridget O'Sullivan, who had come in from the store next door at the sound of the horses, and he said, "Bridget, get me 4 men I can deputize tonight and get them on horses and get them down here in 12 minutes. "Yes, Sheriff," said Bridget O'Sullivan, and she went out into the cold at a run, and she did not in fact take 12 minutes. There was one more thing in the office that Adelaide did not expect. There was a man sitting in the corner. He was thin. He had narrow shoulders. He had something of the same set of jaws she had seen on the smaller of the 2 riders who had flanked Crane's carriage on the porch in November. He had been sitting in the corner with his hands folded very still, and he stood up now and he came forward into the lamplight, and he said in a quiet voice that did not match his face, "Ma'am, my name is Lucian Crane. I am the younger brother of the man who tried to take your husband today. I have been working with Sheriff Holloway since the 3rd week of November. There are things I would like to say in front of you and the sheriff both before you ride. And there is one thing I would like to give you." He held out a folded paper. It was the deathbed letter of a woman. It was the deathbed letter of his stepmother. The woman had died, he said, in the year 72, in the late summer of a slow illness she had been carrying for almost 5 years. She had been bedridden through the spring of that year in a room above her husband's bank, and the walls of that room were thin, and she had heard things in the months of her dying that a wife is not meant to hear. On one particular night in early July, she had heard her husband say to his older son in the back room 1 floor below her what he meant to do about a man named Ezekiel Maddox who had become inconvenient. She had heard the older son ride out the next morning. She had heard 2 nights later that Ezekiel Maddox had been found at the foot of a draw. She had lived another 6 weeks. On the last day of her life, she had written it all down in a hand that was already shaking every word she had heard through the wall. She had hidden the letter inside a hymn book. She had given the hymn book to the only person in that house she had still trusted, which was his younger son. She had told the boy not to open it for 5 years. She had told him that 5 years would be long enough for him to know whether he was his father's son or his mother's. He had opened the hymn book on the 5th anniversary of her death. He had read the letter. He had sat with it for nearly 2 years because he had not known what to do with it. He had come in the end to Sheriff Holloway. He had come a week before Crane had ridden up to the Maddox cabin in his white coat. He had brought the hymn book and the letter. "I have stood beside my brother in white coats and on horses and in courtrooms since I was a boy," said Lucian Crane in the lamplight of the sheriff's office. "I have done it because I was afraid of him. I am still afraid of him. But I am not any more willing to be his witness. Whatever the 4 of you ride into tonight on that mountain, I am riding with you. And whatever happens when the territory court asks me what I know, I will tell them what I know. I will tell them about Ezekiel Maddox. I will tell them about the silver vein. I will tell them what my mother heard my father say. I am tired, ma'am. I am tired of being his shadow." Sheriff Holloway looked at him for a long count. "Get a horse, son," he said. They rode out of Silver Creek before the bell at the church had finished striking 9. 6 men, 1 woman, all armed. The moon had come up over the eastern ridge by the time they hit the wagon road. They rode fast. They rode the way men ride when they know that someone they love is alone in the snow on the wrong side of a fight. What had happened in the high meadow, Adelaide would learn afterward, was this. Silas had let them come on. He had let them come within 30 yards. He had let Crane speak first because Crane was the kind of man who needed to speak first. You are a long way from your cabin, Mr. Maddox. I am exactly where I mean to be, Mr. Crane. You found the seam. I found the seam. Then you understand we cannot both leave this meadow. I understand that. The two men who rode with Crane beside Lucy on were the same hired guns who had sat their horses beside the carriage in November. Their hands were on their pistols. They were not, however, faster than Wyatt Maddox in the trees with a long rifle and a clean line of sight and a brother in the open in front of him. Wyatt fired once. The first hired man came off his horse without a sound. Wyatt fired twice. The second hired man came off his horse with a sound, but not for long. The whole exchange took something less than 4 seconds. Crane was alone on his horse on the meadow and then with Silas Maddox in front of him and Wyatt's rifle somewhere in the trees behind him, in the cold blue sky above them, in the small leather pouch of silver dust riding south down the mountain in his enemy's wife's saddlebag. He drew. He was slow. He had never been a man who used his own hands. Silas was not slow. Silas put the bullet exactly where he had meant to put it for 7 years. He put it through Harlan Crane's right shoulder lobe, the place a man could survive if he lived long enough to get to a doctor and spend the rest of his life looking down the wrong side of a rope. He did not kill him. He had been very clear with himself on the long ride up the meadow with his wife behind him that he was not going to kill Harlan Crane. He was going to leave Harlan Crane alive for a court to hang. Crane went off his horse. He hit the snow on his back. He lay there making the small, high sound a man makes when the cold has gotten into a wound very fast. Silas dismounted. He walked over. He stood above Crane in the snow. "You killed my father," he said quietly. "You sent men up to my cabin, and you stood on my porch, and you put a price on my wife. You will live tonight, Mr. Crane. You will live tomorrow. You will live until the territory hangs you, and on the day they hang you, it will be in the front row, and I will not look away. Get up. You are walking down off this mountain." It was at that moment that the riders from Silver Creek came up over the rise of the meadow at full gallop, and Adelaide Maddox saw in the moonlight her husband standing alive in the white meadow beside a man in a white coat in the snow, and she did not slow her horse, and she did not call out, and when she came up alongside him, she came down off the saddle, straight into his arms, and he caught her, and he held her, and he did not let her go for a long time. The trial was in Denver in May. It lasted 4 days. Lucian Crane took the stand on the second day, and he gave his testimony, every word of it, and his voice did not shake. The hymn book was entered into evidence. The pencil notation on the back of the HC letter was entered into evidence. The leather pouch of dust was entered into evidence. The packet of 12 letters was entered into evidence. Silas Maddox testified. Wyatt Maddox testified. Adelaide Maddox testified in her crimson dress with her hair pinned up, and she did not waver, and she did not look at the man at the defense table, and the jury did not take more than 2 hours. Harlan Crane was hanged in the territorial yard on a clear morning in June. Silas Maddox was in the front row, as he had said he would be, and he did not look away. He came home to his wife that night, and he sat with her on the porch, and he did not speak for a long while, and then he said, "It is done." And she said, "Yes, it is done." The land was theirs. The silver was theirs. The future, which had been a thing measured in days for so many years, was now a thing that could be measured in seasons. Lucian Crane did not stay in Silver Creek. He went west the following year to Oregon with a small inheritance the court had not been able to take away from him because he had been the witness who broke the case. He wrote to the Maddox place once a year every Christmas for the rest of Adelaide's life. The letters were short. The letters were always grateful. The first thaw came in April. Adelaide planted a small garden behind the cabin and a single apple sapling at the corner of the porch that her grandchildren would decades later climb. The sapling took. Most of the things she planted that first spring took. She had a way with growing things that surprised even her. By the autumn of '79, she was carrying their first child. Hollis built another room on the back of the cabin without being asked, and Wyatt rode down to Silver Creek and came back with a cradle he had bought from Bridget O'Sullivan, who had begun to talk a great deal about a cousin newly arrived from County Cork, and whether perhaps the middle Maddox brother might like to make her acquaintance. The boy was born in October. They named him Ezekiel Maddox after the grandfather he would never meet. Silas held him for the first time with hands that shook the way they had not shaken on the meadow with Crane, and Hollis stood in the doorway with his hat in both hands and his eyes wet, and Wyatt sat down hard on the kitchen bench and stared at the wall, and did not, despite his best effort, keep his face from going through everything it went through. It was Toby, 12 years old, still on that day, who said it. "Pa," he said to Silas. "Pa, he is tiny." "He'll grow," Silas said. They do. The next spring, Hollis married Neve O'Sullivan, the cousin from County Cork, in the same small white church where Silas had married Adelaide. Neve had red hair and a laugh that you could hear from the next farm over, and a way of standing up to Wyatt that nobody else in the family had ever managed. They built a smaller cabin 200 yards east of the main one by the creek, because Hollis said any man who shared a kitchen with two other men for going on 16 years had earned the right to a kitchen that was his own. Wyatt held out 2 more years. Then in the summer of '82, he met Prudence Hutchings, the new school teacher in Silver Creek, at a barn raising up the valley. Prudence was a thin, quiet woman from Chicago who had come west on her own to teach, and who, on the 3rd time Wyatt called on her, told him that she did not require to be impressed by him, only liked, and that she suspected he was much better at the second than at the first. They were married in the autumn. They built a 3rd cabin on the far side of the South Meadow. Mary Maddox was born in the spring of '83. Margaret Pemberton Maddox came in the winter of '84, and they named her after Eulalia Pemberton, the old woman on the train who had told Adelaide to watch a man's hands, and who had died that November in a boarding house in Topeka, and who had left Adelaide in her will a single brass thimble and a folded note that said, "Only child you watched well." Toby grew up. He grew tall, taller than any of his 3 fathers had expected, and almost as tall as Silas. He had an interest from very young in the law. Silas had not understood it at first. Silas had thought for one quiet, ungenerous month in the year '80 that the boy ought to want to be a rancher. Adelaide had set him straight. She had said, "Silas Maddox, that boy, lost his real father to a fence post, and his second father to 72, and he watched a man hang for it, and you will let him be the kind of man who keeps that from happening to anybody else." Silas, who had been wrong about almost nothing in 15 years, had recognized that he was being wrong now, and he had not been wrong about it again. Toby went to Denver to read law in the autumn of '84. The family paid for it, all of them, every adult Maddox putting in their share without being asked. He came home each summer. He passed his examinations in '88. He came back to Silver Creek to practice. 12 years later, he ran for territorial judge and won. And on the day he was seated, every Maddox in 3 cabins came down off the mountain in their best clothes to watch. And Silas Maddox sat in the front row of the courtroom and did not look away from his son for a single minute of the swearing in. That was the family they built. That was the slow, patient work of 20 years and 25 and 30. The mountain learned all of their names. The mountain held all of them. The mountain, which had not cared, became over those slow seasons the only country any of them remembered as home. It is a summer afternoon in 1908. Silas Maddox is 62 years old. His hair has gone the color of weathered cedar. His shoulders are still wide, but he moves now the way old strong men move, carefully choosing his steps. The right hand that once shook when he held a newborn has gone a little stiff in the cold months, and he favors it without thinking. He sits on the porch of the big 2-story house. They had built it together, the brothers and the hired hands, and Silas himself in the year '90 with the silver his father had left buried under a cairn. The first cabin still stands at the foot of the rise behind the house. They have never torn it down. It will be standing when his great-grandchildren are grown. Adelaide Maddox is 53. Her honey blonde hair has gone the color of pewter. There is fine, careful work around her eyes from a life of squinting against high mountain sun, and her hands are no longer the small white hands that once read a letter 10 times in a Boston attic. They are working hands now. They have been working hands for 30 years. She still wears her mother's wedding ring on a chain around her neck beneath a high-necked summer dress where she has worn it every day of those 30 years. She is sitting on the porch beside her husband. She has knitting in her lap. She is not knitting at the moment. She has set the knitting aside. She has put one hand on the back of his hand on the arm of the rocking chair, and the two old hands are sitting there in the sun together, the way they have sat together in suns of every season for 30 years. In the yard below the porch, 8 grandchildren are running through the wildflowers. Ezekiel's 3, Mary's 2, Margaret's 1 who was 5, and trying to keep up with the older cousins and not always succeeding. Hollis and Neve's twin girls who are 17 and home for the summer from a college in Boulder, and who are at the moment trying to organize the smaller children into some game whose rules nobody understands. Hollis is in the yard with them. He is 60. He still cooks for any gathering of more than 6 Maddoxes. He is showing one of the granddaughters how to braid a length of bridal leather without snarling it. Neve is laughing somewhere beyond him, in the kind of laugh you can hear from the next farm over. Wyatt is on the south porch smoking a pipe. He is 58. The temper has burned off him over 30 years, the way the bark burns off a fence post in a stove, leaving only the heartwood. Prudence is beside him with a book. Their 4 children are grown and gone, with their own places, their own children, their own slow, steady piece of the same long work. Toby is here too, 42 years old, Judge Hartley these 8 years, up from Silver Creek with his wife and his 2 boys for the Sunday meal. He has come to every Sunday meal he has been able to since he was 12. He has missed 3. He is sitting on the bottom step of the porch in his shirt sleeves, his hat off his face turned to watch the children in the wildflowers. And there is in his face, even now at 42, the very early version of the smile he had given Adelaide Whitfield in a doorway of crimson cold 30 years ago. The town of Silver Creek has 800 souls in it now. There is a hospital. There is a library. There is a small school that Adelaide Maddox started in the year 80, and that is now called the Maddox Academy, and that has this past year 200 students. Sheriff Holloway is buried in the town cemetery these 10 years with full honors. Bridget O'Sullivan has buried her husband and outlived her own predictions and runs the store still at 70. The country has come up around them gentled by their slow work the way a mountain is gentled by water, and it is no longer the country. A young woman in a crimson dress stepped down into off a stagecoach in the autumn of 78. A small girl breaks away from the group in the yard and runs up the porch steps. She is 5. Her name is Adelaide after her grandmother, but everyone calls her Addie. She has honey blonde hair. She has eyes the color of cornflowers. She climbs into her grandmother's lap without ceremony, the way only a 5-year-old can, and she puts her small hands on her grandmother's face and she says, "Grandma, Grandma, tell the story." "Which story, child?" "The one about how you came up here, the one with the train, and the man with the cold eyes, and the bad man in the white coat, and the silver under the rock." "That one," Adelaide says, "is a long story." "I know. It will go all the way until supper. I know. You are sure. I am sure." Silas, on the rocking chair beside them, smiles very small, very slow. The smile he has been giving his wife for 30 years for things only the 2 of them remember. She begins. She begins the way she has begun the story for every grandchild in turn who has been old enough to ask. She begins with a wooden platform in the failing light and a wind that came down off the Rockies like something hunting, and a letter that had promised her a home and had lied. She begins with 3 men who came up out of the snow in the dusk, and the tallest one in the middle, who watched her with the eyes of a man who had been waiting all his life to be honest with somebody, and the youngest one in the back is with his hand on a pistol, who had not yet decided whether she was a friend or a problem, and the middle one, the quiet one with his hands folded, the way a man folds his hands at a graveside. She tells of an old woman on a train. She tells of an attic in Boston. She tells of a wedding ring on a chain. She tells of a long pine table and a piano in the corner of a cabin that had been bought at auction in Denver by a man who had not yet known he was buying it for her. She tells of a boy in a doorway with a blanket around his shoulders, asking her if she was going to live with them. She tells of bread that was burned past the point of saving, and of a coyote in the snow, and of a man stitching his own shoulder by lamplight at 3 in the morning. She tells of a cellar and a loose brick and a packet of letters tied with old twine. She tells of a blizzard that buried the world, and of one man who rode out into it for a small brown bottle, and another woman who held a wedding ring up to the white morning and made a promise she has spent 30 years keeping. She tells of a meadow in February, and a lightning aspen, and a cairn on a holy ground. She tells of a younger brother in a lamplit office who had carried for 2 years the deathbed letter of his stepmother in a hymn book, and who had decided finally not to be a shadow. She tells of a courtroom. She tells of a hanging. She tells more carefully than the rest of a long, quiet wedding in a little white church in the soft snow on a December afternoon, in the door of a cabin closing gentle as breath against the wind. She tells of children born in 3 cabins, and of a boy who became a judge, and of a mountain that learned very slowly all their names. She tells it the way a good storyteller tells a story she has told many times, with the quiet places left quiet, and the bright places left bright, and the bad parts not lingered on, but not left out either, because the bad parts were the price of the rest of it. And you do not leave a price out of a true story. When she is done, the long shadows of late afternoon have come up the porch, and the youngest cousin has fallen asleep against her grandfather's knee, and Hollis from the yard is calling that supper is ready in 20 minutes, and that anyone who is hungry had better come and wash. Above the eastern ridge, a single column of clouds is climbing up the sky, dark at the bottom, edged with white where the late sun catches it. A storm is gathering, the first one of August. "Storm coming," Silas says in the same low voice he has used for 30 years to say it. Adelaide smiles. She closes the small girl's hand around her own. She watches the dark clouds come up over the ridge. "Let it come," she says. Behind them in the kitchen, Nive is laughing about something. Hollis is calling the children in. Wyatt and Prudence are stacking plates at the long table in the yard the way they have been stacking plates at it for 20 years. Tobias Hartley is on the bottom step in his shirt sleeves, helping the youngest cousin to her feet. The first cool wind of the storm comes up off the meadow and moves through the wildflowers, and the wildflowers all bend the same way at once, the way fields do when something old and patient is passing through them. Silas Maddox takes his wife's old hand in his old hand and holds it. "Winter always ends, Della," he says very low, the way he has said it for 30 years. Yes, she answers the way she has answered it for 30 years. "You are home now, yes. You are right where you are supposed to be." Yes. She still remembers stepping down off the stage into a wind that promised her nothing, with $50 and a folded letter and her mother's ring against her skin. She still remembers the platform and the cold and 3 men coming up the boards in the dusk. She still remembers the moment she chose to stay. 30 years later, on the porch of the house they built with their own hands, with the children of 3 cabins running in the wildflowers below them, she thinks the same quiet thought she has thought every August evening of her long, good life on this mountain, that she thinks was the day my life began.